Anyone have questions about paper number 3?
When's paper 3 due?
The date's on the back of the handout. What is it? Monday, April 23rd. So 20 days from now, so just under 3 weeks, we're obviously working through the stack of the partial drafts. I said this before, but I'll reiterate. We'll get them back to you as soon as we're able. As soon as we're through the full stack, we'll hand them back. But if you are eager for feedback prior to that, just come see one of us, and ideally give us a heads up. I mean, me, you got to make an appointment with to come see me anyway. Vanessa, you can usually drop in. But either way, if you're looking for feedback on the paper in particular, just tell us that you're coming, because most of the stack is on Vanessa's desk, but there's a few papers on my desk. And if you just come see one of us without telling us, they might not, I or Vanessa might not have your paper, right? But if you give us heads up, if we have a chance, we'll read through it before you get there, and then we can give you some feedback, right? Otherwise, we'll just wait, and we'll hand them all back as soon as we have them all done. But feel free to come see us if you want some individual feedback sooner. Okay. Any questions? All right, so our topic today is abortion. I think I'm going to start off, I'm going to show us a clip from John Oliver. I'm a little bit on the fence about this, right? I'm going to show it because it's educational, and I think you will learn something from it and remember it better than just me telling it to you, because it's entertaining, but it's also got adult content and language in it, right? Raise your hand if you watch John Oliver regularly. Raise your hand if you don't watch it regularly, but you have seen it on occasion. Raise your hand if you've never seen it. All right, it's a late night, right, comedy/news show. It's got adult language and content. So it's relevant to the topic we're talking about today. I think it's going to be valuable, but I'm just warning everybody about that, right? So.
Concerns breast implants. Some are against them, others believe they're fine in rare cases, and many believe you should be able to get them whenever the you want. Sorry, did I say breast implants? I meant abortions. Tonight's main topic concerns abortion. And look, before you change the channel, I know this is a polarising topic. Although, interestingly, when the website Vox asked people in the street for their opinions, the issue wasn't quite as binary as it's usually presented.
If I had to pick, I would say that I'm pro-choice, but personally I'm more on a somewhere in the middle.
I wouldn't, but I can't choose for other people.
I'm pretty hard pro-life. I think when the baby is heartbeat, that should be the cutoff point. That's just my stance. I'm not the kind of guy that I want everyone to follow my stance.
Okay, well, not needing anyone to follow your stance is a healthy attitude to abortion, and it's also a terrible attitude with which to lead the Rockettes. You do you, Bethany. You do you, girl. You do you. The truth is, people's opinions on abortion make up a spectrum. But most of us believe it should be legal in at least a few circumstances. In fact, only 19% of Americans told Gallup they thought it should be completely illegal. And if you are in that 19%, you are frankly excused from watching the rest of this. But do we join us at 11:29? Because once I'm done talking about this, we'll all be watching a video featuring a bucket of sloths. And I promise you, it is almost violently delightful. But until that time, the rest of us really do need to talk about abortion laws. Because wherever you are on this spectrum, whether you, like me, believe that women should have the right to choose, or whether you believe abortion should only be allowed in a few circumstances, then this story should concern you. And here is why. Since 2010, new state laws have contributed to the closure of about 70 abortion clinics. And these 4 states are down to exactly 1 abortion clinic each. That's right, Mississippi now has 4 times as many S's as it has abortion clinics. And if you're thinking, how is that possible? Well, it's in no small part because the key Supreme Court decision concerning abortion is no longer Roe versus Wade. It's the 1992 Planned Parenthood versus Casey ruling that said states can create restrictions as long as they don't place an undue burden that places a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion. Meaning women can be asked to jump through a few hoops, just not too many. Which might sound a little less insulting if those weren't also the rules for a dog agility course. And the vagueness of that rule has allowed states to introduce dozens of what some have called trap laws, or targeted regulation of abortion providers, though their supporters, to an eerie degree, all characterise them somewhat differently.
This is really about the issue of women's health.
We're protecting women's health and safety.
We are protecting women's health.
I just wanted to reiterate that this is really all about protecting the health and safety of women.
Yeah, but when you're that insistent about women's health, it starts to sound suspicious. It's like having a folder on your computer called Definitely Not Porn. You're not fooling anyone, you're asking more questions than you're answering. So let's take a look at what these laws actually do for women's health, starting with Texas's HB2, which passed in 2013 and had 2 key stipulations.
It requires abortion clinics to meet the same building standards as outpatient surgical centers and requires their doctors to have hospital admitting privileges.
Okay, now hospital admitting privileges and high building standards sound great until you realise what they actually mean. Sort of how Moondance sounds like a lovely night of romance and whimsy, but really means having sex with Van Morrison. And that's not what you signed up for. Because the outpatient surgical centre requirements can be difficult to fulfil, as this Texas clinic discovered.
Explain again why it's going to be shut down, because this isn't wide enough?
Yeah, because right now the walls that we have, they're about 3 feet wide, and to be an ASC, it has to be 8 feet wide.
Now, I'm not saying width isn't important. In fact, in some circumstances, it's far more important than length. Is a thing that I have heard. Penises, I'm talking about penises. But that 8-foot requirement is wide enough for 2 surgical gurneys to pass one another in a corridor, which is just not something that is likely to happen at a small abortion clinic. About 90% of abortions occur in the first trimester, when they are generally non-surgical procedures with no cutting and only mild sedation. They usually involve suction or just taking medication, neither of which require a large surgical facility. You don't need an operating room to take a pill, which is a good thing, because you wouldn't want an entire surgical team scrubbing in every time Larry King needed a boner. They'll get tired. And as for Texas's law, that doctors have admitting privileges at a local hospital, a requirement 10 other states have also passed, that can shut a clinic down, because many hospitals, for financial or political reasons, won't grant them to a doctor who performs abortions. And again, defenders of these laws will say they have a simple purpose.
By requiring that abortion is obtained, admitting privileges at local hospitals, we are protecting women's health.
Yeah, but are you though? Because it's worth noting both the AMA and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have argued there is simply no medical basis for requiring local admitting privileges, which does make sense, because hospitals will see anyone. They'll see you if you've got an Elmo Pez dispenser stuck in your butt. They'll have questions for you, but they will see you. They'll see you, they'll question you, and later they may laugh at you. And while we are on the subject of safety, legal abortions have a mortality rate of 0.00073%. That is nearly 10 times less than what one study found was the risk for dying as the result of a colonoscopy. And let's agree, by the way, all of us, death by colonoscopy has to be one of the worst ways to die. Right after having your mother catch you masturbating, and while you're trying to pull your pants up, you fall and hit your head, so your dad has to carry you pantsless to the car to take you to the hospital, and the girl next door you have a crush on tries to help, but she's laughing so hard at the size of your penis that she closes the door on your hand, startling your mother, who slams her foot on the gas, dragging you behind the car for several blocks, while your father yells your TV show is derivative and you'll never escape the shadow of Jon Stewart. That's what we're all afraid of, right? That's what we're all pretty afraid. That's a general fear. If admitting privileges are so important for continuity of care, it is weird that you don't need them in Texas to run a birthing centre, even though one study found that 12% of women admitted to birthing centres wound up being transferred to a hospital. So Texas will shut down an abortion clinic for having walls too close together. But if you want to give birth in a tub surrounded by mood lighting, potpourri and the music of Bon Iver, no one will say anything other than just take it down a notch. And proponents of these laws will point to a few notorious cases, like the clinic run by Kermit Gosnell in Pennsylvania, who wound up being convicted of murder. Although, for the record, his clinic had not been inspected for 17 years, which it absolutely should have been. They didn't need new laws so much as they needed to bother to enforce the ones they had. Putting absurd new restrictions on all clinics because of Kermit Gosnell is like seeing that photo of a Taco Bell employee licking the food and saying, OK, all restaurants have to have corridors that are 8 feet wide. Well, hold on, that's going to shut down most of the restaurants in the country, and you've done nothing to address the root problem here. And some of these laws have nothing whatsoever to do with clinic safety, like the ones that force doctors like Willie Parker to actively spread misinformation.
The state requires me to cover some very basic information with you. First, the state requires me to tell you that if you're having an abortion, there's the possibility of having complications. There's a risk of bleeding, there's a risk of infection, there's a risk of damage to any of your organs. But guess what? Those are all the exact same risk from continuing pregnancy and going to term. The final thing that I have to tell you that I don't agree with, but I have to tell you anyway, having an abortion can increase your risk for breast cancer. There's not a shred of scientific evidence to prove that. They can require me to tell you the first part, but they can't stop me from giving you my best medical opinion, and that is that there's no increased risk for breast cancer from an abortion.
It must be so weird. It must be weird for a woman to witness her medical professional forced to play a game of good doctor, bad doctor. OK, time for your tetanus booster. No, those cause autism. Well, there's not a shred of scientific evidence to prove that. Bad doctor. Bad doctor. In addition, some states have passed laws requiring providers to show and describe an ultrasound image, whether a woman wants to see that or not. And when North Carolina was defending such a law, this was how they attempted to soften that.
The proposed law says if a woman wishes not to see the ultrasound or hear the fetal heartbeat, she may cover her ears and eyes and refuse to listen.
Oh, great. So North Carolina tried to give women viewing ultrasounds the same option as women trying to watch John Travolta's performance in the new O.J. Simpson show. Oh, my God! Oh, my God, what is he doing? Oh, does he think Robert Shapiro was a sad clown in a Baz Luhrmann movie? I didn't want to watch this. Why are you making me? And some other clinics enter into a bureaucratic war as a result of these laws. Take this clinic in Alabama. It was shut down after not being able to meet the new building codes Alabama had forced upon it. But instead of giving up, the owner cashed in his retirement savings to open a new facility that complied completely with the law. And that is when Alabama started targeting him directly.
I've spent close to $1 million to meet all of their requirements.
And you think you're done, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to pass another bill that said I can't be in 2,000 feet of the school.
They're treating me, the patients, the physicians, as sex offenders.
They're treating someone like a sex offender when he clearly isn't one. It's a move that's now commonly known as a reverse Cosby. And look, if you're thinking that, John, when a clinic closes, can't women just travel further? You should know there are now mandatory waiting periods in 27 states, some up to 72 hours between an initial consult and an abortion. So women can be forced to either take multiple trips or plan the shittiest 3-day weekend imaginable. And if that's not possible, they can end up making desperate decisions. Listen to one clinic administrator describe a call from a patient.
I told her, you can come to San Antonio, we can help you here. And she said, I can't, I don't have the means, there's no way I can get to San Antonio. So what if I tell you what I have in my kitchen cabinet and you tell me what I can do?
I'll tell you what I have in my kitchen cabinet and you can tell me what I can do. When your state's abortion laws are forcing people into the most depressing quickfire challenge in Top Chef history, I think it's safe to say they've gone too fucking far. Because here is the thing. Abortion cannot just be theoretically legal. It has to be literally accessible. And remember, every single one of us watching this right now, every single one of us watching right now agrees that it should be legal at the very least in a few extreme circumstances. Say, hypothetically, a young girl has been the victim of sexual assault. Well, thanks to these laws, this hypothetical girl might have to travel a long distance because there were no clinics close to her. And again, thanks to these laws, the girl might be approaching the point where her state won't let her get the procedure at all. Well, sadly, none of that is hypothetical, and I'll let a Texas clinic director tell you the rest.
In order to see more, I need to put her to sleep. And in order to do that, I need a nurse anesthetist. And because this crazy law, it is impossible to find people to work for us. She's 13 years old, and she is a victim of rape, and she drove 4 hours from McAllen to San Antonio, and we had to turn her away. And there was nothing I could do to save her. And so now, if she has a procedure, and that if is huge, she'll have to go all the way to New Mexico and pay $5,000 and get there and spend 3 days. It'll never happen. We know it won't.
And at that point, we have sentenced a child to motherhood. Now that specific provider, Whole Woman's Health, is actually at the centre of a Supreme Court case. It will be heard next month.
This clip is 2 years old, so the Supreme Court has already decided that case.
If it's a 4-4 tie, the Texas laws stand. So the best hope is that Justice Kennedy, seen here in dog form, straightening his tie, will see Texas's regulation as an undue burden. This whole situation is basically in his paws now. Meanwhile, Florida is drafting similar trap laws, and the law in Alabama that would close that one clinic near a school will be introduced to committee later this week. And if all this has made you sad or angry, then you should really keep an eye on these laws. And if you don't have a problem with the current situation, then, well, it is 11:29. Welcome.
We don't need to see the barrel full of sluts. You can watch that on your own. All right. Apologies for all the adult content, right? That is a pretty good summary of a fairly widespread practice of state abortion regulation. To some extent, since Roe versus Wade in 1973, but as John Oliver mentioned, particularly since 2010, right? The Republican Party captured control of both houses of the state legislature in a number of states in 2010, and with Republican control of both houses of the legislature, there was a big new wave of abortion regulations that was enacted in a large number of states. And you heard descriptions of several examples of those kinds of regulations. Now, so we've talked about Roe versus Wade. 1973 protected the right of a woman to terminate a pregnancy under the word liberty in the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. Under Roe versus Wade, how would we decide if some of these laws are constitutional or not. Where would we start? Under what we know from Roe versus Wade back in 1973. Yeah.
It says that the woman has a right to an abortion in the first trimester.
Mm-hmm. And so, what does that tell? What does that tell us about someone? Pick one or more of these laws.
Then it's unconstitutional.
Okay, so for sure, if a state denies the right to abortion during the first trimester, then it would seem like that violates Roe versus Wade. But pick one of the specific laws here, right? So there's a whole bunch of them, right? There were laws requiring abortion providers to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, laws governing the physical structure and standards of the building in which the abortions are provided, laws imposing mandatory waiting periods where you have to visit the abortion provider and then come back after a set number of hours, laws requiring the abortion providers to give you certain state-mandated information before you have the procedure. Pick one of those, and how would Roe apply to that?
Well, I think what it's done is, like, as a standalone, none of those laws necessarily prohibit a woman from having an abortion. But when you compound state laws mixed with, like, some of the mandated waiting periods, it becomes very difficult if you experience any hiccup along the way to maybe get an abortion in the first trimester. Like, especially when people don't have the financial means to, navigate several states or the waiting periods. Each of those laws individually might not prohibit a woman from getting an abortion, but when you put two or three of them together, it becomes very difficult, especially when some of them force clinics to close and there's only one in the entire state. If that plan fails, then you're past the minimum time, or the maximum time as it was.
Other thoughts? Right, the abortion law at issue in Roe versus Wade, which was from Texas, was a criminal ban on basically all abortions. The only exception was if the doctor says it's necessary to save the pregnant woman's life. That's the only lawful time in which you could terminate a pregnancy. So these laws are not that, right? These laws, none of them say that. None of them say abortion is illegal altogether, right? They don't do that, right? They are regulations of abortion, which the state says are passed in order to protect women's health, and which have the effect in practice of preventing lots of women from actually exercising their right to abortion. Can the state do that or not? How do we decide? Like, where does that start? Yeah.
In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, didn't it say that when it comes to these things, you have to weigh the burden it places upon people versus the benefit for the populace, I guess, from the perspective of the legislature?
Yep. So John Oliver referred briefly to this, right? So in Roe, as of 1973, right, our answer would have to have something to do with the trimester framework, right? Well, in the first trimester, they say you basically have a complete constitutional right to choose to terminate a pregnancy. There's no reason for the state to regulate that at all. If your doctor says it's good and you choose to have it, there's no legitimate basis for the state to regulate it. But the rules shift in the second and third trimesters. That's under Roe, right? Under Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is like 20 years later, it's in 1992, the court adopts a different standard. They reaffirm that women have a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy, but they adopt a different standard for deciding whether a particular abortion regulation is constitutional or not. They say, we're not doing the trimester thing anymore. We have a new standard that applies throughout the whole term of pregnancy. John Oliver showed you a little quote from it. It's the undue burden standard. Which is basically a balancing test, right? Like a balancing test from the First Amendment law, right? Basically a balancing test. It says, does the restriction on abortion impose an undue burden on the woman's ability to exercise her constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy? So some burdens are okay if the state has a legitimate reason for imposing them, but undue burdens are not okay. That is obviously a little bit vague, right? So it's a starting point. So again, I'm going to say pick one of these laws, or more than one of them together, because as Colin mentioned, they do kind of add up together to have a collective impact. But pick one or more of these laws and walk us through how would we decide if that law is constitutional or not? Well, what would we need to look for if you're trying to make that argument? Yeah?
I think that having state-required information imposes an undue burden upon women in this scenario because it forces you to have to do the research that you should be able to receive just from a doctor. There's no reason that you should have to do extra research for something when you should be able to ask somebody whose entire profession is to give you the information that you need.
Right?
Kind of working off of that, it actually places an undue burden on doctors who, again, have studied the medical knowledge, who have their own expert opinion, to give something that they don't feel is correct. It creates a big conflict right there, and it impedes upon their ability to inform the population.
Some doctors have tried to challenge these laws on First Amendment grounds, right? Like, when they're making me say something, how are they allowed to do that?
I mean, I would actually go the other direction and say of all the laws, this is the least burdensome. State-mandated informational warnings are quite common.
Cigarette packages.
Right, and of course there's the issue with the information being false or having a doctor say something he doesn't want to say. But all of them, this is, I would say, the least burdensome.
So I was going to say that like having only one clinic in a state is definitely a mass burden, and we saw in the video that was burden. I think that there should probably be like a clinic every, I'm not really good, like distance in like every 500 miles or every like just like a reasonable amount of clinics that have like you can be, every like house has to be in a certain distance of one.
Sure. So so clinics are private facilities set up by healthcare providers and or abortion rights advocates, right, who want to make reproductive health services more widely available to people, right? So there's a Planned Parenthood clinic not far from here, right, which has doctors and nurses on staff, and is part of a national organization that believes all women, regardless of financial means, should have access to a full range of healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare services, right? And so they're privately set up, and so the issue for the courts to decide is how far can the states go in limiting the operations of those private facilities, right? So Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey doesn't require anybody to set up abortion clinics, but those decisions are supposed to allow people to set them up. And then these subsequent laws seem to be having the effect of forcing a lot of these providers to close. In the Texas case, so it's called Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt from 2016, which is based on is a case ruling on those two provisions of the Texas law that John Oliver was focused on. There's data in the case, right? The lawyers introduced and the judges in the opinion quote some of the data about, before this law, there were X number of abortion providers in the state of Texas, and there were X number of women for whom the closest abortion provider was like more than 400 miles away or something. And then after this law was enacted, X number of clinics were forced to close, and now there's X number of women who live at least 400 miles away, right? So that data's in the opinion. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But it's clear that some of these laws have the effect of forcing a number of providers to close and therefore increasing the distance for many women, right? Texas is a gigantic state, right? Increasing the distance for many women of how close the nearest one is.
I think 72 hours is also problematic because, I mean, if Roe versus Wade establishes the precedent that in the first trimester it's legal, it's not uncommon to not find out that you're pregnant for several weeks. So then your clock is ticking on a 90-day window where you could actually have a trimester, or sorry, where you could actually have a legal abortion, and then in that time you also have to get together like quite a bit of a considerable amount of money for someone who might be, you know, younger, like just random pregnancy, and then if you don't get approved for one of the other variety of reasons, and you've already waited that 72 hours, that's, you know, a 30th of your all the time you had to legally get an abortion, not including the time that probably took you to realize you were pregnant to begin with.
That's right.
And you have to repeat that process again.
That's right. And in addition, as pregnancy progresses, the procedure gets more complicated and hence more expensive, and hence fewer available providers. Some providers only do first trimester abortions, and also increases the medical risk, right? If the variety of the delays that the state imposes, and the additional costs that are imposed by the waiting periods, and what are you going to do? Do you have to drive twice or stay in a hotel or whatever? If that pushes your abortion into the second trimester, it gets more expensive and less safe, right? It's a riskier medical procedure. Other thoughts? One of the things the court said in Roe versus Wade is that during the first trimester, it should be just basically between the woman and her doctor. There's no reason for the state to interfere. It's like a routine medical procedure. Nowadays, first trimester abortions are often just taking a pill, as John Oliver said, depending upon how far along in the first trimester you are. Sometimes they can't do it with a pill, but it's still non-surgical, right? There's no cutting involved. No general anesthesia, no cutting, non-surgical outpatient procedure, routine and safe, significantly safer than labor and delivery, right? During the second trimester, the court said in Roe versus Wade, because it is typically a more complicated and riskier procedure at this stage in the pregnancy, the state should be free to impose regulations that are designed to promote the health of the pregnant woman, right? States are, of course, allowed to regulate medical procedures in order to protect patients' health and the like. And this is a medical procedure. And for second trimester abortions, it's sometimes a surgical procedure, right? And so the state should be allowed to pass regulations, the court said in Roe versus Wade, designed to promote and protect the pregnant woman's health. So what do we make of the Texas provisions, right? So again, the two provisions from Texas that he was talking about are the ambulatory surgical center building requirements and the admitting privileges at a local hospital for the provider, both of which Texas state officials say are designed to promote and protect the pregnant woman's health. Yeah.
I'm a little confused. What are the ambulatory admitting privileges?
So it's two different things. Ambulatory surgical centers are a set of building code requirements which say that any facility that provides abortion has to meet the following list of standards that are defined in Texas state law under the definition of ambulatory surgical center, which is a non-hospital facility that conducts surgery, right? And so there's a lot of specific provisions. We heard about one of them, which is about the width of the hallways, right? So that two stretchers can go down the hall past each other, which is obviously a good requirement in a hospital, in an ER, right? Where, at least on TV, I don't know, there's always multiple stretchers going past each other in the hallway. But many healthcare procedures are not provided in hospitals, right? They are provided in a special place that does colonoscopies, right? Or a special place that does cosmetic surgery, right? Or a special place that does breast implants, right? Or a special place that does abortions, right? And those are not hospitals, right? But states have some categories to put them in and to regulate them. And so one provision of Texas law says any facility that provides abortions, even first trimester abortions, which are not surgical procedures, has to meet the requirements of an ambulatory surgical center, which is a lot of specific things about the width of the hallways, the width of the doors, and the like. That's one. A second requirement, two separate provisions of the law, is that the one's about the buildings and one's about the providers. The providers, right, so the doctors who are going to perform abortions lawfully in the state of Texas, have to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, which is a fairly complicated and technical set of rules regarding how hospitals and doctors interact with each other, right? Most doctors are not employed by hospitals, right? Doctors work for their own private practice, right? Sometimes one doctor has a little shop. Sometimes it's a team of like 10 doctors, right, that have a pediatric practice with its own building. Hospitals have rules about what doctors are routinely allowed to sign someone into the hospital, right? This person came into my office. I've examined her. I think she's a candidate for hospitalization. She needs observation overnight. I'm signing a form which automatically admits her to that hospital. Hospitals typically have long, complicated rules about who has those admitting privileges. Part of the rules are about how many patients they're going to send to the hospital each year, right? Because the hospitals are trying to make money. But hospitals are required to admit patients with emergent medical conditions, no matter who their doctor is, right? I mean, if you are giving birth at a birthing center or at your house, which is legal, right, and there's complications that arrive and an ambulance rushes you to the hospital is required to admit you, regardless of who your doctor is. And so abortion providers and the American College of Obstetricians and the American Medical Association say that it doesn't make any sense. There's no logical reason to impose this requirement on abortion providers, and it is not a requirement that Texas imposes on other, right? Midwives who deliver babies in homes don't have to have admitting privileges at the nearest hospital, right? That's not a requirement that's imposed on other healthcare procedures. So those are the two different requirements. Both of them, Texas lawmakers say, are intended to protect the health of the pregnant woman, which the Supreme Court has said is a legitimate reason for regulating abortion. The problem here is that doctors almost universally say that the laws, in fact, do not protect the health of any pregnant women. That is not factually correct. And so then the question is what the courts should do in such a situation. Yeah.
Well, I would say the one about the building codes. Dentist's office provides surgery. I mean, they often do root canals and whatnot, but if they're not imposed to the same standards, then how is that? Again, a pregnant woman would probably go to the dentist's office, and that might save her life. How is it that you don't impose the same rules on them? But the other thing that might save her life, you impose heavy rules on them.
Say that part again.
How is it that what's it called? That you can impose some rule on the abortion clinic?
Yeah.
It's optionally safer and a much more quick procedure, whereas on a dentist's office, which you heard, you actually have a higher chance of actual root canal than a pregnancy.
I have a question. The undue burden, is that for the, officers as well, or it's just for the woman? Like, the way it was worded?
The way the court phrases it in Planned Parenthood versus Casey is that a state legislative regulation of abortion is constitutional so long as it does not impose an undue burden on the woman's ability to exercise her constitutional right to terminate pregnancy. It's a pretty long, convoluted sentence, right? That's how they phrase it, right? So it's focused on the woman, who's the one exercising the constitutional right. One thing that is not really clear in the Casey opinion, and lawyers and scholars have always kind of debated this back and forth, it's not really clear whether they mean like on women in general Like, do they mean, like, statistically? Like, how many women would likely to be prevented from exercising their constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy by this requirement? Or do they mean, in any particular case, for this particular woman who is asserting her constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy, does the law unduly burden her right? The opinion is not really clear on that, but it is focused on the women. Yeah.
I think also, like, this case is kind of problematic because I think it's starting to, like, it represents, like an increasing polarity in the Supreme Court because of, like, what Scalia had to say when he dissented. Like, not only does it, like, kind of provide avenues for states to go around certain legislation, national legislation, if they want to, like, prevent people from getting abortions, but also, like, I don't know, like, with Scalia's comments afterwards, it kind of shows that there's, like, a widening gap from, like, the liberal and conservative perspectives in the Supreme Court.
Okay, so for sure, these cases have been divisive and polarizing on the court, you know. So Roe versus Wade was 7-2, and President Reagan, among others, was quite critical of the decision, and he promised to appoint judges who would move in a different direction, and one of his appointments was Justice Scalia. By the mid-1980s, by 1986, Supreme Court its abortion decisions were typically being decided by 5-4 votes. And in 1987, President Reagan nominated Robert Bork to replace Justice Powell, who was in the majority in those 5-4 decisions. And so everybody was expecting that to be the appointment that would flip the court on abortion rights. But Bork was not confirmed by the Senate, and Reagan had to settle for Anthony Kennedy, who was also a conservative Republican, but less ideologically conservative than Bork, by all accounts, and so people didn't really know for sure what he was going to do on abortion. And so basically we've had the status quo that we've had since the 1980s, is that the court has continued to reaffirm Roe versus Wade by 5-4 votes, right? But it has, on occasion, allowed significant leeway to states to restrict abortion, right? They're still not allowed to outlaw abortion, right? That would clearly violate Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and the states occasionally, a state legislature is like, well, let's see what happens, and occasionally states have tried to pass a law that outlaws abortion altogether, and the lower courts just strike it down right away. But these other kinds of restrictions, it's not immediately clear, right? I mean, if Roe said you can regulate abortion to protect women's health, and if the state says it's protecting women's health, then some lawyers and judges have said, okay, well, that's fine. They're allowed to do that. And other lawyers and judges have said, wait a minute. They can't just say anything, right? And stick the words women's health like on the cover or whatever, and then they're allowed to do it. Like, that's not right. We have to actually look at it in some detail. And the court has been quite sharply divided in these cases, right? Including this recent one from Texas. One part of the thinking here, one just logically to just work through in our minds, like, well, how do we think the court will and should approach these questions, right? So we're basically talking about a balancing test, right? The advantage of which is that it allows some flexibility to say some kinds of regulations are okay and some kinds are not okay, right? Free speech is important, right? But we think some kinds of restrictions on free speech should be allowed and some should not be allowed. So let's figure out how we're going to weigh the different interests against each other in a particular case, and it's flexible. The disadvantage is it's vague and somewhat unpredictable, and it's hard to tell what kinds of things the court would uphold and what kinds it would not uphold, right? In general, when the court is trying to weigh in a balance somebody's constitutional right against some important reason that the state says it has for restricting the right? Free speech and national security, right? We're trying to weigh them in a balance. In general, one thing that the court does is it looks at the purposes of the law, right, and how important they are, and it also looks at the connection between the purposes and the specific details of the law, right? So you can think of this as looking at the ends and the means. So the court has said that protecting national security is sometimes important enough to justify a restriction on free speech. But that doesn't mean that slapping a sticker with the words national security on top of a speech regulation necessarily it justifies the regulation, right? We have to look at the connection between national security and what the law is actually doing, right? And if we don't actually see any plausible, rational connection between, right, saying nobody is allowed to publicly advocate Islam, right? That is not actually plausibly connected to protecting national security. We don't believe that if the connection between the means and the ends doesn't look very good, it raises suspicion about what the ends really are. If Texas says the purpose of requiring abortion providers to have 8-foot wide hallways, the purpose of that is to protect women's health. That's what Texas says. But if no doctor agrees with that, right, no doctor thinks that regulation actually promotes and protects women's health, right, the connection is not very good between that specific legislative requirement and the supposed end that the law is serving. And if the connection is not very good, that raises suspicion that that is not really the purpose of the law, right? The purpose of the law, maybe, is not really to protect women's health, but to reduce access to abortion. And if we're weighing in a balance, well, how much of a burden does this impose on the woman's constitutional right, and is it justified or not? If the purpose is just to reduce access to abortions, that does not seem as heavy in the balance as to protect women's health, right? That is not... The purpose is to reduce access to abortion, right? All right, they're just trying to reduce access to abortion, but women have a constitutional right to choose to have an abortion, right? So you got to put something else in the other side of that scale besides just reducing abortions, right? What is the purpose that is supposedly outweighing the women's constitutional right? Something other than just reducing abortions. That would be one thing the court would usually look at. Maurice?
Who has, does the state have to prove that their law is protecting women's health, or do women have to prove that the law does not protect women's health? Which way does that go?
The court is not clear about that in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and there has been dispute about it, right? So since 1992, this short phrase, it's a little longer than these two words, right? But this basic phrase has been the governing legal standard since 1992. And there have been lots of disputes in lower courts about what it exactly means, right? And part of those disputes are about who has the burden of proof and what is it that I think the right answer is just that the Supreme Court has not given a clear answer to that question. Another way to think of it is that the court just gives conflicting signals on that question, right? So the justices who tend to be more supportive of abortion rights have tended to look somewhat skeptically at the state restrictions on abortion and tell the state, you got to come up with some legitimate justification for this that's actually connected to the law, right? And we haven't seen one. And the justices who tend to be less supportive of abortion rights have tended to look more deferentially at the state's interests and said, well, obviously the state's allowed to regulate medical procedures however it wants, as long as it's not violating someone's constitutional rights. The state can pass any kind of regulations of medical procedures it wants. That's the state legislature's job. That's not our job. And so they say it's for women's health. They're allowed to pass laws to protect women's health, right? It's just two different... The court has been pretty polarized on this, right? With two different paradigms, or frameworks, or whatever the right word there is, right, being imposed. So in Casey, in 1992, a couple things I want to say about this. So at the time, it is a long time ago now for you guys, I still remember this case. I think this is probably the first, I don't know if this is right. No, that can't be right. It was right about, I graduated college in 92, so and I took con law as an undergrad, so I obviously knew about some other Supreme Court cases before this one. But I actually remember when this one was like headline news. Right, 92 was an election year. Bill Clinton was running against George Bush, the first George Bush. Decision came down in June of an election year, and the expectation, widespread expectation, was that the court was going to use this case to reverse Roe versus Wade. Right? There were 7, 8? I think there were 8 Republican appointees on the court in 1992. The only people on the court that we knew supported Roe versus Wade were Justice Blackmun. He was still there, and he wrote the opinion in Roe versus Wade, and Justice Stevens. Stevens is the one who just called for a constitutional amendment to reverse the Second Amendment. He's not on the court anymore, but he's still alive. And those guys are both Republicans, right? Blackmun and Stevens are both Republicans, but they both supported Roe versus Wade. The other justices on the court were Rehnquist, Nixon appointee, and White. He's the only Democrat. White, who was a Kennedy appointee. And those guys both dissented in Roe versus Wade. So we know they're opposed to it, right? And then there were 5 people appointed by Presidents Reagan or Bush, right? Scalia, O'Connor, Kennedy, Souter, and Thomas. And as far as anyone knew, all those folks were opposed to Roe versus Wade, right? The presidents who appointed them were for sure opposed to Roe versus Wade. Some of them had been on the court already for a few years and had issued some decisions that seemed quite critical of Roe versus Wade. O'Connor and Scalia had both done that. So everybody was expecting Roe versus Wade to get overturned, and Roe did not get overturned, right? So that's like the headline news in Planned Parenthood versus Casey at the time in 1992. Supreme Court surprisingly reaffirms Roe versus Wade 5-4, and what happened is 3 of those Reagan-Bush appointees decided to reaffirm it, right? And then plus Stevens and Blackmun, that made 5, right? So Roe versus Wade gets reaffirmed. There's 2 main reasons they reaffirmed it. Reason number 1, they decided it was correct after all, maybe, right? Some of them had been critical of Roe versus Wade, so it was O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter were the 3 judges appointed by Reagan or Bush who voted to reaffirm Roe versus Wade. Some of them had been critical of Roe versus Wade, but none of them had ever definitively said 100% it's wrong and should be reversed. They had not done that. And so maybe they decided it's just fundamentally correct. And if you read the opinion in Casey, there's a long section in there that goes back to Griswold. And in fact, it goes back to Poe versus Ullman, which is the privacy rights case like a year or 2 before Griswold. Also about Connecticut's contraception law, same law that the court decided on in Griswold. The court didn't really decide the issue in Poe, so there was a famous concurring opinion by Justice Harlan in that case that talked about the court's fundamental duty to interpret our evolving conceptions of liberty under the 14th Amendment, and the right of a married couple to choose to use contraceptives in the privacy of their own home is for sure part of that liberty. They went back to that. They had lots of quotes from that opinion. They had quotes from Griswold, and they just seemed to say that Roe was fundamentally correct, right? Whether we agree with it personally or not is not the question, right? But that the claim that a woman's decision to terminate a pregnancy is part of the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment is fundamentally correct. And the quote that's at the top of your handout is like that's from that section of the opinion, right? Talking about all these other fundamentally private, personal decisions that we have previously held are protected by the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, and the decision to terminate a pregnancy is one of those decisions. Right? A second reason that they might have upheld it is they don't think it was correct, or maybe they haven't decided, they're not sure, maybe they don't agree with each other whether it was correct originally or not, but it is the established law of the land, and under the doctrine of precedent, right, stare decisis is the Latin phrase that the judges use, which means let the decision stand. Under the doctrine of stare decisis, our ordinary rule should be to adhere to our prior decisions. Is that an absolute rule? Obviously not. Right? We overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education, and they talk about that in Casey. So there's another long section of the opinion where they talk about their understanding of the doctrine of precedent, and they talk about Brown and Plessy in that section of the opinion. They say, obviously, sometimes overturning a precedent is the right thing to do. But here, they say, Roe is well established, right? It's been on the books for almost 2 decades. It has not proven unworkable in any respect. It's controversial, but not unworkable, right? Everybody knows since 1973 that a woman has a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy, right? That hasn't proven like not to work in practice somehow. There's no new and additional information that has come to light that we didn't have in 1973, right? That would lead us to say that the precedent should be changed, right? In Brown, the court made a big deal about how the role of public education was way different now in the mid-20th century than it previously had been, plus our understanding of racial equality had evolved over time. Obviously, some people understood racial equality in the 19th century too. White Supreme Court justices really didn't understand it that well, right? And so our understanding of it has evolved over time. As a nation, like white people's understanding of racial equality has evolved over time, and we now recognize, which we didn't recognize in 1896, that legally imposed racial segregation in the schools harms black children, right? We don't see anything similar like that here. The decision was controversial in 1973, and it's still controversial today. Some people agree with it, some people disagree with it, but we don't see any new and additional information that has been brought to light that would justify reversing our precedent. And, this was a key point, if we did reverse it today, if we reversed it today, right, and there's no new information that's come to light, it's not proven unworkable, nothing about the relevant facts has changed since 1973, and if we went ahead and reversed it anyway, it would be clear to everybody that we were doing so because of political pressure, right? Several of us, they say this in the opinion, something like this. They say this. They say the United States, which means the Solicitor General's office representing the U.S. government, they say the United States, in this case, today, for the 5th time, has asked us to overturn Roe versus Wade. Right? It was the 5th abortion case during the Reagan-Bush era in which the lawyer for the federal government had said, Roe versus Wade is wrong, you should overturn it. Right? So it's clear that the executive branch is pushing the court to overturn it. Plus, they say, some of us were appointed by presidents who have repeatedly called for Roe versus Wade to be overturned. And so if we did overturn it under those circumstances, it'd be clear to everybody that we were doing so because of political pressure, which would be bad for the court. Right? It would send a bad message about the institution of the Supreme Court. That if they're protecting some constitutional right that you don't agree with, all you got to do is lean on them for a while, and they will cave. And we don't want to send that message. So 2 different reasons. It could be both of them played a role. They're both in the opinion. Could be one of them was more important for some of the justices and one was more important for some of the justices. Right? But 2 different reasons that the court reaffirms Roe. It was A, fundamentally correct, Or B, whether or not it was fundamentally correct, it's the governing precedent and we have not been persuaded that there's any good reason to overturn it. Right? So that's the headline news in June 1992 about Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But the thing that is important about Planned Parenthood versus Casey today is a different section of the opinion, which is this part. The part where the court spells out the rules, which are different rules than they spelled out in 1973. Right? We are reaffirming, the way they phrase it is, we are reaffirming the central holding of Roe versus Wade, which is that a woman has a constitutionally protected right to terminate a pregnancy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. However, we are revising or updating or altering the specific legal rules governing how we decide whether particular abortion regulations are constitutional or not. Right? And that's where they describe the undue burden standard. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is a case from Pennsylvania, there were several specific provisions involved, which I have in my notes here somewhere. Anyway, I pretty much remember them. There was a waiting period. Pennsylvania had a 24-hour waiting period, right? So not as bad as 72 hours, obviously, but you did have to visit. If the abortion clinic's down the street, a 24-hour waiting period is not that onerous, although it still might mean 2 different days off work or whatever. But if the nearest abortion clinic is 100 miles away, then that means a hotel or sleeping in your car or 2 trips or whatever. It had the mandated state mandated information that the providers had to give you. It did not. The content of some of those state mandated information has been ratcheted up over the years, so it did not include the thing about breast cancer. In recent years, some states have said providers have to tell you that abortion increases the risk of suicide, which, again, doctors say there is no actual evidence for. It did not include either of those. It was mostly 2 categories of information. There was 3 categories. There was information about the medical risks, which is something that is often required for other medical procedures. There was information about fetal development, right? So they did not have ultrasound requirements yet. That's another one that was in John Oliver that we haven't talked about yet, mandatory ultrasounds. So those, they didn't have those yet. But they had to provide you with like written and verbal information about the stages of fetal development, right? Our best estimate is that your fetus is at 13 weeks. Here is what a 13-week fetus looks like and is doing or whatever. And they had to provide you information about alternatives to abortion. Right? If you decide not to have an abortion, here's some information that the state says we should give you about adoption or what have you. So that was in there. There was a parental involvement requirement for minors seeking abortion. Right? If you are not 18, right, then you have to inform your parents before we can give you an abortion. And there was a spousal requirement. If you were married, we will not perform an abortion without written consent from your husband. Those were the key provisions of the Pennsylvania law that the court had to decide whether they imposed undue burdens on the woman's right to terminate the pregnancy. The court upheld all of them except the last one. The court struck down the spousal consent requirement, and it upheld all the other ones. And it said, in our estimation, these do not impose an undue burden on the woman's exercise of her constitutional right. The waiting period, the mandatory information, they don't impose an undue burden. And so then the question for lawyers and judges is, okay, like the Supreme Court in 1992 said you can have a waiting period, 24-hour waiting period in this case, and mandated information. But every year some state, all right, let's try a longer waiting period. How about some states adopted 48, and then a couple states adopted 72 hours, and let's add more stuff to the mandated information. Let's add some medical information that most doctors say is false, right? And so they keep ratcheting it up And so there's further litigation forcing courts to decide again whether these newer laws with more restrictive requirements, whether they impose undue burdens. Right? And the court has still been trying to decide case by case each new set of laws that comes up. Questions so far? So I want us to come back to the Texas case, which is the court's most recent ruling on these issues. But I think I want to say two other issues before the Texas case. So one of the issues in the Pennsylvania law was parental consent, right? If you're 16, you got to get a parent's consent before you can have an abortion. In some earlier cases, the Supreme Court had said parental consent requirements are okay as long as there's some kind of exception, right? And the phrase that they use to describe the exception is there should be a judicial bypass option, right? So it is constitutional for a state to require minors seeking abortion to get the consent of a parent, so long as there is an alternative. The alternative is the minor can instead go before a local judge, and if she can persuade the judge that she is mature enough to make this decision on her own, and that it is in her best interests to do so without informing her parents, for example, because they will physically abuse her or kick her out of the house or whatever else the case may be, then the judge can authorize the abortion without parental notification. So that's a good example of balancing, right? They're like, well, okay, on the one hand, ordinarily minors don't have medical procedures without their parents' involvement, right? On the other hand, this is a constitutional right, and it is clear that there are some teenage girls who are living in homes where they could not safely inform their parents that they are pregnant, right? And so we're trying to balance it. Two important things. So you can require parental consent, but there's got to be a way that a minor could have some other avenue available to her. Going to the judge, persuading her that it's in her best interest and she's mature enough to make the decision on her own.
Was that like from a Supreme Court ruling or lower court?
Supreme Court. So there's several cases in the 80s in which the court, again, the court typically goes like one case at a time, trying to decide one thing. So there were some state laws that had said, oh, you have to get the written consent from both of your parents. And then the Supreme Court struck that down and they say, okay, state passed law said you just have to have written consent from one parent. And then some states tried to say, oh, you don't have to actually have the consent of your parents, but you have to attest in writing that you have notified your parents, right? So there's all different versions that come up. And so the court weighs in on the issue repeatedly. And it's the Supreme Court that comes up, with help from the lawyers, obviously, who are suggesting things. But it's the Supreme Court that comes up with the idea that parental involvement statutes are okay, provided that they have a judicial bypass. One of the things that's come up about these cases is there's scholars, including someone I know who's done a lot of research on this. In lots of regions of the country, judges do a horrible job at handling these requests, right? So technically, judges are required to conduct an expeditious hearing, right? Remember, time is of the essence, right? We're required to conduct an expeditious hearing where they give the minor the opportunity to make these arguments and then they rule quickly. There's a lot of evidence of poor compliance with the Supreme Court's rules. So I know a political scientist who hired undergraduates to call local courthouses in various regions of the country and say, I have a friend who's pregnant, she's 15, and she's trying to find out if she can get an abortion. If she can't tell her parents, what should I tell her? and just people on the phone would say something blatantly false and illegal, or say, I don't know anything about that, there's nothing you can do, or try to badger the person into telling their friend she should not have an abortion, right? Just lots and lots of examples of noncompliance. Or then once you manage to get into a courtroom, right, judges just not appearing to be willing to entertain the possibility that that in some cases an abortion in the absence of parental notification could be in someone's best interest. So that's an issue. The Supreme Court doesn't get into the weeds that much, right? The Supreme Court says what the rules are, and they are not always fully adhered to on the ground.
That's, in my opinion, that's problematic on all sides. Like, as I'm thinking about it, there's arguments for each side that I think are totally valid. From the child standpoint, aren't most lower court judges partisan? Like they are Republican or Democrat?
It depends. It's different in different states. In some states, they're elected in partisan elections. In some states, they're elected in nonpartisan elections, and in some states, they're appointed by governors.
But yeah, that's problematic.
Yeah.
And then even from the parent side of it, that's still kind of problematic.
Yeah.
Because your child can't sign to join the military without your consent.
That's right. That's right.
So they can do this like that.
And they can't have cosmetic surgery without your consent, right? I mean, ordinarily you can't volunteer yourself for a medical procedure if you are not 18 years old. And so that's the thing here, right? The reason that a balancing exercise regarding constitutional rights is sometimes really challenging is because there are important things in both sides of the balance, right? And so that makes it hard, right? But it's still, the courts are in a position where they still have to decide something, right? I'll give you another one. So during the Clinton era, so in the 1990s, a bunch of states enacted a new set of abortion regulations. So basically there's been various waves. John Oliver was talking about post-2010, but there's been earlier waves where a particular state legislature will get persuaded to enact, well, here's something we came up with, there's a new kind of regulation of abortion, and some state legislature enacts it, and then other states will copy it, right? So there'll be a wave of particular kinds of abortion regulations, and then the courts have to decide whether this new one is allowed or not. So in the 90s there was a wave, a bunch of states enacted bans on a particular kind of abortion procedure, which is referred to in the regulations, the laws enacted by the state legislatures, is usually referred to as partial birth abortion, which is not actually a medical term. That's a term that's invented by opponents of the procedure to characterize it. The medical term for the procedure is dilation and extraction. And the procedure is pretty gruesome, right? And the phrase partial birth abortion can give you a sense of what you think might be involved in it. The procedure is for sure pretty gruesome. And the Supreme Court's opinions about it include graphic descriptions of the procedure, and you can read those. But in some circumstance, and it's an exceedingly rare procedure, extremely rare, right? It is only used for late-term abortions, which typically happen either because somebody didn't know they were pregnant or wasn't able to cobble together the money or whatever until late in pregnancy, or somebody finds something out late in pregnancy that leads them, they wanted to have a baby, but they find out that the fetus is not viable late in pregnancy, and they therefore decide to terminate the pregnancy, that sort of thing. And for some late-term abortions, this is the safest procedure available, right? And so doctors are saying, we hardly ever do this, but it is a medical procedure that in some circumstances is medically indicated. It is the safest way, in this particular small set of cases, safest way for us to terminate a pregnancy. Nebraska passed a law that said it's illegal. Supreme Court struck that law down. They said it's an undue burden, right? It's not. Remember the question of, does undue burden mean statistically lots of women are prevented from having abortion? The Supreme Court says no, that's not what it means, right? There's not lots of women prevented from having abortions by this law because it's exceedingly rare. But for particular women who find out late in pregnancy that something that leads them to want to terminate this pregnancy, and their doctor says it's the safest procedure, and the state of Nebraska says their doctor's not allowed to use this procedure, which is another way of saying their doctor is mandated to use a less safe procedure, right? That is an undue burden on that woman's exercise of her constitutional right. Supreme Court strikes it down. 3 years later, Congress passes an almost identical law, nationwide ban on partial birth abortion. That one gets challenged. By the time it comes to the Supreme Court, George W. Bush has appointed 2 justices, and the Supreme Court upholds that one. Both those cases are 5-4, and they come out in opposite directions, right? And the Supreme Court says, they're saying like the opposite, right? They say states have good interest in regulating this procedure, right? It's a procedure that's shocking to many people, right? It's the fetus. We have said in the past, right, that sometimes the procedure is used post-viability, although often it's used pre-viability, just late, close to that point. But we have said in the past that the further along in the pregnancy, the greater the state's interest in protecting the potential life of the fetus. And this is something that states should be free to regulate. And the one particular controversial aspect of the federal law, which is still in place, is it does not include any kind of exceptions for maternal health. Right? So even in a situation where the doctor is saying, this is the safest procedure for us to use right now, it is medically indicated, in my opinion, this woman should not continue this pregnancy to term, the healthiest thing for her is to terminate this pregnancy, and this is the safest way for us to do it, still not allowed to do it, right, under this federal law that the Supreme Court upheld. So that case, which was in 2007, Gonzalez versus Carhart, seemed to signal that the court was newly maybe willing to cut back on Roe versus Wade a little bit. And then 2010, a bunch of Republican legislatures get elected, and as we saw in John Oliver, they pass a whole new wave of restrictions, and there have been challenges to lots of those. There have been lots of lower court rulings on different specific things, mandatory ultrasounds, for example. But the two things that the Supreme Court has weighed in on are from the Texas case, the ambulatory surgical requirement building standards, and the hospital admitting privileges requirement for providers. And the Supreme Court struck both of those down in 2016 in a 5-4 decision with Justice Kennedy in the majority, together with the 4 Democratic appointees. Justice Kennedy was in the majority in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. He's still in the majority here. They say these impose an undue burden, right? Breyer writes the opinion, and he's got lots of stuff in there about, here's how many women now live more than 400 miles away from the nearest abortion provider. The effect of these provisions, maybe even their intent, but definitely the effect of these provisions is to prevent lots of women from exercising their constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy. And that's not allowed under the 14th Amendment. That was in 2016. That one was 5-3 because Justice Scalia had passed away by the time that one was decided. So that one was 5-3. And so on that particular issue, the court still has a majority in support of abortion rights, even though Scalia has now been replaced by Trump's nominee, Neil Gorsuch. That's still only 4 votes, right? Kennedy has sometimes voted to uphold abortion restrictions, but in this most recent case, he voted to strike them down. He is sticking with what he said in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Laws that impose an undue burden on the woman's right violate the Constitution. To flip that, abortion opponents will probably need an additional Supreme Court appointment still in the coming years. All right, that's all.